No one imagined that the man wearing worn-out sneakers could shut down the entire hospital with a single signature, and that was exactly why he had walked through the doors dressed that way. It was 8 o'clock on a Monday morning when Dr. Daniel Mitchell entered Street Isabel County Hospital. He wore old jeans, scuffed sneakers, and carried a battered medical folder under his arm. At first glance he looked like a struggling patient, just another person among the dozens waiting to be seen. The paperwork he handed to the receptionist listed a different name: James Carter. "Do you have health insurance?" the receptionist asked without barely looking up. Daniel shook his head. "No. And I've had severe stomach pain since last night." The woman pushed a form across the counter. "Then you'll need to fill this out and wait until they call you for triage." What no one knew was that Daniel had not come there simply to receive medical care. His real name was Dr. Daniel Mitchell, a senior health inspector with the State Department of Health. For weeks, his department had received complaints about the hospital, low-income patients being ignored, uninsured people treated with disrespect, and patients who appeared financially comfortable receiving faster attention. Hospital administrators denied every accusation. So Daniel had made a risky decision. He would not announce his inspection. He wanted to experience the system from the inside. Not as an inspector. Not as a doctor. But as someone everyone believed they could simply ignore. And as he sat in that overcrowded waiting room, he began discovering that the complaints might have been far worse than anyone had reported. Daniel remained seated in one of the plastic chairs, his folder resting on his knees and his eyes seemingly fixed on the floor. From the outside he looked exhausted, vulnerable, almost defeated. But in reality he was watching everything. Every gesture. Every response. Every subtle change in tone. Daniel paid attention to all of it. Because the complaints that had reached the State Department of Health over the previous few weeks were not about one isolated mistake or a single bad experience, they pointed to something far more serious. A pattern. Low-income patients claimed they had spent hours waiting without receiving any explanation. Uninsured patients said some employees treated them as though asking for help was itself a burden. And several accounts told the same story: whenever someone arrived well-dressed, connected, or apparently financially comfortable, their treatment seemed to move faster. The complaints kept coming into the department. First one, then another, then 5 more. Eventually there were too many to dismiss. Yet, when the state requested an official explanation from Street Isabel County Hospital, the administration's response had been firm. There was no systemic problem. Everything had been exaggerated. According to hospital officials, every patient was treated according to medical need, regardless of their money, appearance, or personal circumstances. On paper it sounded flawless. But Daniel knew a report could be perfectly written while hiding a completely different reality. That was why he was there. He did not want statistics prepared for an inspection. He did not want spotless hallways because someone had been warned he was coming. He did not want rehearsed smiles or administrators repeating words like equality, dignity, and patient care because they knew exactly what an inspector wanted to hear. He wanted to see what happened when no one knew he was watching. And he did not have to wait long. A few feet away, an older man had been sitting there for what appeared to be a very long time. His face looked exhausted and his hands were clasped tightly in his lap as though he were trying to convince himself to keep waiting patiently. Daniel leaned slightly toward him. "Have you been waiting long?" The man slowly turned his head. "Almost 2 hours." Daniel's expression tightened. "To see a doctor?" The man gave a faint, sad smile. "Yes." Then he glanced around before lowering his voice. "I guess people like us just have to wait." The words hit Daniel hard. People like us? He did not need to ask what the man meant. The older patient had seen Daniel's worn jacket, scuffed sneakers, and battered medical folder. He had reached the same conclusion everyone else had. Daniel was someone without money, without influence, and without any real power to demand better treatment. And for the first time since walking through those hospital doors, Daniel understood something no official report could ever truly capture. Discrimination did not always have to be spoken out loud. Sometimes it was hidden in a glance. In a cold response. In an endless wait. In the feeling that your pain mattered less simply because your wallet was empty. A few minutes later, the door to one of the examination rooms opened. A hospital employee stepped into the waiting area with a folder in her hands. "Mr. Reynolds?" A man who had arrived much later immediately stood up. He was dressed sharply and carried himself with the confidence of someone who expected everything to go his way. "Yes, that's me. The doctor is ready to see you." Daniel looked up. The older man who had been waiting for nearly 2 hours looked up as well. Neither of them said a word. They didn't have to. Daniel watched as the newly arrived patient disappeared through the door while other people remained seated, some of them hunched over in obvious pain. And in that moment he felt the entire investigation shift. Until then he had come to verify a series of complaints. Now he was beginning to understand the people who had made them. They were not asking for special treatment. They were not asking for luxury. They were not even asking to be treated better than anyone else. They simply wanted to walk into a public hospital while sick and know that no one would decide how much their suffering mattered by first judging how much money they appeared to have. Daniel lowered his eyes to the form still resting in his hands. His mission had only just begun. And if everything he had witnessed during those first few hours was merely the surface, then Street Isabel County Hospital was hiding a problem far deeper than its administration was willing to admit. One sentence from the hospital's leadership continued to echo in Daniel's mind as he looked across the crowded waiting room. There is no systemic problem. They had repeated those words with almost insulting confidence. Days before arriving at the hospital in that worn jacket and under a false identity, Daniel had taken part in reviewing the official responses submitted by Street Isabel County Hospital. The documents looked flawless. The language was carefully crafted. The protocols were listed in precise detail. Every explanation seemed designed to reduce each complaint to nothing more than a misunderstanding. According to hospital administrators, the complaints had been exaggerated. Wait times depended solely on medical need. There was no preferential treatment. And no one was being discriminated against simply because they had less money. And if any employee had behaved inappropriately, the hospital insisted it had to be treated as an isolated incident. Daniel had read those reports more than once. And the more he read them, the less convinced he became. It was not because he already had enough evidence to accuse anyone. It was because after years of inspecting medical facilities, he knew something all too well. When an institution knew an inspection was coming, it could present a version of itself that looked nothing like its everyday reality. If he had called several days earlier and announced, "Good morning. This is Dr. Daniel Mitchell from the State Department of Health. We'll be conducting an inspection tomorrow," everything would have changed before he ever walked through the doors. Administrators would have reviewed patient records. The hallways would have been spotless and perfectly organized. Every employee would know exactly what to say. Protocols would be displayed where they belonged. The smiles would be warm and professional. And for a few hours, perhaps even an entire day, the hospital might have operated exactly the way it was supposed to operate every day. But Daniel did not want to see a carefully prepared performance. He wanted to see the hospital when no one felt the need to pretend. That was why he had made a decision that transformed the entire investigation. There would be no warning, no suit, no official identification hanging around his neck, and most importantly, no one would know who he really was. He created a simple identity: James Carter, an uninsured man who had come to the emergency department with severe abdominal pain. Nothing more. No influence. No connections. No title powerful enough to open doors. Daniel wanted to discover one thing: how would this hospital treat someone when they believed that person had absolutely no power to hold them accountable? Now, sitting among exhausted patients, he understood exactly how important that decision had been. If he had walked in as an inspector, no one would have casually handed him a form and sent him away. No one would have responded coldly when he said his pain was getting worse. Someone might have personally come out to greet him. Perhaps the hospital's leadership would even have appeared with welcoming smiles and offered to escort him through the facility. But James Carter was not important. At least that was what they believed. Daniel slowly scanned the waiting room. A woman clutched several papers tightly against her chest. A man kept glancing toward the examination room doors. Others sat quietly, carrying the unmistakable exhaustion of people who had been waiting far too long for something as basic as medical attention. This was not a waiting room prepared for an inspection. This was reality. And that was precisely why Daniel had come. He was not there to destroy the hospital. He had not arrived with a verdict already written. If the complaints turned out to be false, he would say so. If the administration was telling the truth, his report would reflect that too. But he had to see the truth for himself. Because the gap between what the official reports claimed and what was happening in those hallways was becoming impossible to ignore. Daniel looked down once more at the form bearing the name James Carter. For the first time, the false identity felt disturbingly real. In the eyes of everyone around him, he was no longer an experienced physician. He was not a senior health inspector. He was simply a man with little money who needed help. And that was the real test. If a hospital only shows its best side when it knows someone important is watching, then the problem is not with the complaints. The problem is what happens when hospital staff believe no one with power is paying attention. Daniel stayed silent. He still did not have all the answers. But with every passing minute, he became more certain that arriving without warning had been the only way to uncover the truth. Daniel remained seated under the name James Carter when the pain he had been pretending to describe began to become, in the eyes of everyone around him, a far more revealing test than any official record. He slowly stood and walked back to the emergency department desk. The receptionist was looking through paperwork, barely bothering to raise her head. "Excuse me," Daniel said calmly. "The stomach pain is getting worse." Is there any chance someone could see me sooner? The woman looked up for only a moment. There was no concern in her expression. No alarm. Only fatigue and impatience. Everyone in this room is here because they're not feeling well. Daniel kept his composure. I understand. I'm just saying the pain is getting stronger. Her answer came immediately. Then you'll have to wait until they call you for triage. That was it? No question about how severe the pain was. No closer look. Not even a few words to make him feel as though his condition mattered. Daniel slowly nodded. Okay. He returned to his seat. Inside, however, something had changed. For years he had reviewed patient care reports. He had studied medical protocols, wait times, complaints, and procedures. He knew perfectly well that an emergency room could become overwhelmed. He understood that not every patient could be seen immediately and that hospital staff often worked under enormous pressure. But this was different. The problem was not simply that he had to wait. It was how they made him feel while he waited. As if his pain were nothing more than an administrative inconvenience. As if saying that his condition was getting worse were somehow an act of disrespect. As if not having health insurance had quietly placed him several steps below everyone else. Daniel looked down at the form still resting in his hands. One box made it unmistakably clear that James Carter had no health insurance. And that detail seemed to have shaped the tone from the very beginning. When he first gave his name, the receptionist had simply followed the standard procedure. When he told the receptionist he had no insurance, the conversation became even colder. You'll need to fill this out. And when he explained that he had been suffering from severe stomach pain since the night before, he did not receive concern, he encountered a barrier. Wait. That word was beginning to carry a very different weight. Waiting could be a normal part of an overcrowded emergency room. But waiting while feeling that no one wanted to listen to you was something else entirely. Daniel looked around at the people sitting nearby. He could not reveal who he really was. Not yet. If he pulled out his official credentials right then, the entire investigation would be over. The receptionist's attitude would change immediately. Someone would notify a supervisor. News would spread through the hallways. And the poor man in the worn-out jacket would disappear, replaced by the state health inspector everyone would suddenly try to impress. That was exactly why Daniel had to remain in his seat. He had to endure the treatment. He needed to understand just how far it went. For several seconds he closed his eyes. He thought about the complaints he had read. People who said they had been ignored. Patients who claimed they had asked for help repeatedly without anyone truly paying attention. People who had walked out of that hospital convinced that their financial situation had mattered more than their suffering. Until that day, Daniel had known those stories only from a distance. They were written statements. Sentences recorded in complaints. Numbers inside an official case file. Now he was beginning to experience what was behind those words. The helplessness of needing help and having no idea when it would come. The humiliation of admitting you had no insurance and watching someone's expression change. The fear of saying you were getting worse and hearing only one response, wait. Daniel opened his eyes. Around him, the doors continued opening and closing. Medical staff hurried through the hallways. The waiting room remained crowded. And to everyone there, he was still James Carter. An uninsured man. A patient who appeared to have very little money. Someone with no important title to mention and no official badge to display. And that was exactly why he refused to leave. Because the more invisible they made him feel, the more clearly he understood what he had come there to uncover. The complaints had never been only about waiting times. They were about dignity. And that morning, sitting on a plastic chair with a battered folder in his hands, Daniel was beginning to experience firsthand how easily that dignity could disappear when people believed you had no power to demand it. Daniel had already been sitting there for far too long when he began to understand that the real problem was not simply how long each patient had to wait, but who seemed to have the privilege of not waiting at all. The emergency room remained crowded. The same exhausted faces, the same crumpled papers clutched in trembling hands. The same anxious eyes repeatedly turning toward the doors, waiting to hear their names called. He was still James Carter, the uninsured man. The patient in the worn jacket whom no one had any reason to treat differently. Then a man walked into the reception area. His arrival should not have meant anything. He was simply another patient who had just come through the doors. But the receptionist's reaction was completely different. "Good morning," the newcomer said. "I have an appointment with Dr. Ortega." The same woman who had spoken to Daniel with obvious impatience only minutes earlier immediately looked up. And smiled. "Of course, Mr. Reynolds. Let me check that for you." Daniel watched from his chair. He made no expression. He said nothing. He simply observed. The woman's tone had changed so dramatically that it was impossible to miss. She no longer seemed irritated. There were no clipped answers. She no longer acted as though helping someone was just another burden during an exhausting morning. "Dr. Ortega is ready to see you," she announced moments later. Mr. Reynolds had barely arrived. Daniel felt something tighten inside him. Beside him, the older man who had been waiting much longer slowly raised his head. His eyes followed the newcomer as he walked toward the examination room. "He just got here," the older man muttered. Daniel looked at him. "Yes." The man let out a dry laugh completely devoid of humor. "Some people sure are lucky." He did not need to say anything else. The scene spoke for itself. Daniel had spent hours trying not to jump to conclusions. He knew hospitals had medical priorities. He understood that a scheduled appointment was not exactly the same as waiting for emergency care. And he knew he could not turn a single difference in treatment into a definitive accusation. But there was one thing he could not get out of his mind. The way people were being treated was different. That had nothing to do with triage. It had nothing to do with the schedule. It had nothing to do with a diagnosis. The coldness with which they had treated James Carter had nothing to do with medical criteria. And neither did the warm smile they had given Mr. Reynolds. Daniel had witnessed both with his own eyes. While some patients had been sitting there for hours exhausted and frightened, enduring pain and uncertainty, Mr. Reynolds had crossed the waiting room as though the doors had already been opened for him before he even arrived. The older man lowered his eyes again. Daniel remembered what he had said earlier. "I guess people like us just have to wait." Now, those words felt even more painful. The man did not seem angry. He seemed used to it. And somehow that was worse. Daniel wondered how many times the older man had experienced something like this, to accept such inequality with that kind of resignation. How many people had sat in those same chairs and watched others walk past them? How many had eventually convinced themselves that this was simply the way things worked? How many had felt they had no right to ask questions because they lacked money, connections, or an appearance that commanded respect? Daniel tightened his grip slightly around the battered folder resting on his knees. In that moment, he understood that inequality could be completely silent. No one had to say, "You are worth less." It was enough to make someone wait without even looking at them. Enough to answer with irritation. Enough to show patience toward some people while treating others with contempt. Enough to open a door immediately for one person while everyone else watched from their chairs. The wound was the same. For weeks, hospital leadership had insisted that every patient received equal treatment. Daniel began wondering whether the people sitting in those executive offices had ever spent an entire morning in that waiting room without revealing who they were. Had they ever sat beside patients who did not even know whom to complain to? Had they ever watched the expressions on their faces when someone who had just arrived disappeared through a door while they remained behind? The answer was becoming painfully clear. If the administrators had truly been there, perhaps they would never have dismissed those complaints as exaggerations. Daniel remained silent. It still was not time to reveal his identity. He needed to keep watching. Because every minute he remained disguised as James Carter revealed another side of the hospital he probably never would have seen while wearing a suit and official badge. As Mr. Reynolds disappeared down the hallway, the older man remained seated beside him. Still waiting. Like so many others. As though he had already learned that certain doors opened faster depending on who was standing on the other side. Daniel stared toward those doors, his calm expression hiding an anger that was becoming increasingly difficult to contain. This inspection was no longer simply about measuring wait times. It was about discovering what kind of patient someone had to be before the hospital decided that person was truly worth seeing. Daniel was still staring at the doorway where Mr. Reynolds had disappeared when a different sound suddenly cut through the waiting room. It was not a scream. It was worse. A broken breath. Uneven. Desperate. A man rushed into the room holding an elderly woman by the arms. She could barely remain standing. Her face was contorted with fear and she struggled desperately to breathe as her chest rose and fell at an alarming pace. "Please help my mother," the man pleaded as he rushed toward the reception desk. Several people in the waiting room turned to look. So did Daniel. The receptionist raised her head. "Sir, you need to check her in first." The man stared at her as if he could not believe what he had just heard. "What?" "I need her information before she can be seen." The woman struggled to draw another breath. A weak strained sound escaped her throat. Her son tightened his grip around her. "But she can barely breathe." The receptionist kept the same flat tone. "I understand, but I still need her information." For a moment, Daniel wondered if he had heard her correctly. All morning, he had been trying to distinguish between an emergency room that was simply overwhelmed and behavior that crossed the line into a serious failure of basic humanity. This was no longer about a long wait. It was not about a scheduled appointment. It was not even about someone's tone of voice. An elderly woman was standing in front of them, barely able to breathe. And the first response had been to ask for her information. "Please," her son begged again. "She's getting worse. Call a nurse right now." The woman suddenly bent forward slightly. Daniel stood. He did it almost without thinking. For hours he had forced himself to observe, to remain silent, to let James Carter endure everything without stepping in unless absolutely necessary. But there were limits that no inspector, no doctor, and no human being could simply watch from a chair. He moved quickly toward them. "She needs immediate help." The receptionist looked at him, clearly annoyed. "Sir, please stay out of this." Daniel pointed toward the woman. "She is having trouble breathing." The receptionist slowly looked him up and down. The old jacket. The worn jeans. The cheap sneakers. "Are you a doctor?" Daniel paused. He knew exactly what the truthful answer was, but James Carter could not give it. "No." "Then please sit down." Those words hit Daniel harder than he expected. Not because he felt insulted. That no longer mattered to him. It was because the person who desperately needed help was still standing there fighting for every breath while the conversation had become focused on paperwork, authority, and procedure. The woman's son was on the verge of breaking down. "Please?" Daniel did not look away. "She needs a wheelchair." Now, his voice had changed. He was no longer speaking like a patient politely asking whether someone could see him. His tone was firm. Clear. Impossible to ignore. Finally, someone responded. "Get a wheelchair." Everything happened quickly after that. A wheelchair was brought from the hallway. The woman was helped into it while her son stayed beside her, refusing to let go of her hand. "She goes straight to triage," one of the staff members said. The man nodded, completely overwhelmed. "Please? Save my mother? We're going to take care of her." The wheelchair disappeared through the doors, and the waiting room fell strangely quiet. Daniel remained standing for a few seconds. He felt both relief and anger. Relief because finally the woman was receiving care. Anger because it had taken that much to make it happen. He slowly returned to his chair. The older man who had been waiting for hours watched him but said nothing. Daniel said nothing either. There was no need. He had just witnessed something no official report could soften with administrative language. A hospital could have rules. It could require information. It could demand registration and documentation. All of that was part of normal hospital operations. But when someone cannot breathe, the order of priority should be obvious. Life comes first. Paperwork comes second. Daniel looked toward the reception desk. He remembered all those official documents in which the hospital administration had insisted that every patient was treated according to medical need. Maybe on paper it was true. But the scene Daniel had just witnessed revealed something far more disturbing. When bureaucracy becomes a barrier between a person and the help they desperately need, it stops being organization. It becomes a danger. And the hardest part was that the woman had not asked for special treatment. Neither had her son. They had not asked for a private room. They had not demanded a specific doctor. They had not requested any special privilege. They had asked for something far more basic. For someone to look at a woman who could barely breathe and understand before asking for her name that she needed help. Daniel lowered his eyes. He was still James Carter. He still had not revealed who he really was. But inside him, the health inspector was beginning to collect questions that someone would soon have to answer. Because if a genuine emergency could be delayed even for a few moments by a form, then the problem inside this hospital was even more serious than he had imagined. The image of that elderly woman being rushed away in a wheelchair remained fixed in Daniel's mind as he began to think he had finally seen enough to understand what was happening inside the hospital. He was wrong. The worst was still ahead. Some time passed before another conversation caught his attention. A few feet from the reception desk, a middle-aged man was speaking with one of the hospital employees. His face showed the exhaustion of someone who had been waiting for hours and spending every remaining ounce of patience trying not to lose control. "I was told my wife will have to wait another 3 hours," he said, almost pleading. The employee did not even seem surprised. "That's the schedule." The man pressed his lips together. "She can't wait that long." There was no arrogance in his voice. Only fear. The quiet kind of fear that takes over when someone you love is sick and you begin to feel time slipping away. Daniel watched from his chair. He expected an explanation, maybe some guidance, perhaps a few reassuring words. Instead, the employee lowered his voice. "Come see me by the side entrance in 10 minutes. The husband frowned. "For what?" The employee glanced around before answering. "If you want to get this moved along faster, there may be another way." A chill ran through Daniel. He did not need to hear much more to understand that the conversation had crossed a serious line. The husband understood it too. What way? A few tense seconds passed. Then the question came out, filled with disbelief and embarrassment. "You want money?" The employee did not need to say much. The answer was already there. In the silence. In the implication. In the discreet meeting he had suggested by the side entrance. The man reached into his pocket. When he pulled his hand back out, he was holding the little money he had. "This is all I have." Daniel felt anger rising from deep in his chest. Until that moment, he had witnessed coldness. He had seen patients treated differently. He had watched bureaucracy get in the way of an emergency. But this was different. This was not indifference. This was taking advantage of someone's desperation. The man standing in front of him was not trying to buy luxury. He was not paying for a better room. He was not looking for special treatment simply because it was more convenient. He wanted only one thing: for his wife to receive medical attention before her condition became worse. And someone had just turned that fear into an opportunity to make money. Daniel clenched his jaw. For a moment he wanted to stand up, pull out his credentials and put an end to everything right there. He could do it. He could give them his real name. He could reveal that the man in the worn-out jacket was not James Carter. But he forced himself to remain seated. Not yet. He needed to know how deep this system went. If he intervened now, they would discover who he was, and every door in the hospital would suddenly close before he could uncover the truth. The husband slowly walked away. His worry was written all over his face. Daniel followed him with his eyes and felt something difficult to put into words. Anger, yes. But also sadness. Because the man had walked into a hospital expecting help and had ended up feeling as though he needed to pay for something that should never depend on a secret arrangement. Daniel thought about the words hospital leadership had repeated again and again. There are no serious problems. The complaints are exaggerated. Now those statements were almost unbearable to hear in his mind. How could anyone claim there was no problem when a desperate family member was quietly pulled aside and offered a way to speed up his wife's care? How could anyone dismiss that as an exaggeration? Daniel looked around the waiting room. The other patients continued waiting, unaware of what had just happened. Some stared down at their paperwork. Others checked the time. Some simply sat there exhausted. For them, it was just another endless morning in the emergency room. For Daniel, it had become evidence of something far more serious than he had expected. Because there was a difference between a system that simply failed and a system where someone learned how to profit from those failures. The hospital was filled with vulnerable patients. People who were frightened. Families who would give anything to get help for someone they loved. And that was exactly why what had happened was so serious. When someone is terrified of losing a loved one, they stop thinking about what is fair. They think about saving them. Taking advantage of that moment crossed a line Daniel was not willing to ignore. He lowered his eyes to the battered folder under his arm. On the outside he was still James Carter. Poor. Uninsured. Invisible. But inside, Dr. Daniel Mitchell, the health inspector, had just made a decision. What had happened would not become a simple note buried in an inspection report. Someone would have to answer for it. Because in a hospital, medical attention may depend on the severity of a patient's condition. It may depend on available resources. It may depend on clinical priorities. But it should never depend on how much money a desperate person can pull from his pocket. Daniel remained seated for several minutes after witnessing the conversation near the side entrance. The anger was still there. Not an explosive kind of anger, but the kind that settles deep in your chest and makes you examine every detail more carefully. He had seen indifference. He had seen favoritism. He had watched a woman struggling to breathe become trapped even briefly behind questions and paperwork. And now he had seen an employee take advantage of a desperate husband's fear. For a moment, Daniel began to wonder whether this hospital had completely forgotten why it existed in the first place. Then he heard a voice beside him. "Are you still feeling worse?" Daniel looked up. It was a nurse who had passed through the waiting room several times that morning. She clearly did not have time to spare. Like everyone else, she was moving quickly, trying to keep up with the demands around her. But unlike some of the others, she had stopped. She was actually looking at him. Not at his jacket. Not at his sneakers. Not at the battered folder. At him? A little, Daniel answered. The nurse glanced at the paperwork in his hands. "You really don't have insurance?" Daniel shook his head. "No." The nurse was silent for a few seconds. Then she lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry." Daniel's brow tightened slightly. Those two words surprised him more than any explanation could have. "Why are you apologizing?" She took a deep breath before answering. "Because people without insurance are often treated like they're a problem instead of a patient." Daniel did not respond right away. He had expected excuses. He had expected someone to deny what was happening. All morning he had encountered people who acted as though nothing unusual was taking place. But this woman had just acknowledged it. Plainly. Without polished language. Without hiding behind hospital policy. "Have you noticed it too?" Daniel asked. The nurse gave him a tired smile. "I've worked here for 6 years." Her answer said almost everything. Daniel studied her carefully. "And it bothers you?" The woman slowly exhaled. "Every day." There was no drama in her voice. Only exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had spent years witnessing something she believed was wrong while knowing she could not change everything around her. Daniel asked the question that had been forming in his mind since she began speaking. Then why do you stay? The nurse glanced across the waiting room. People waiting. Worried families. Patients clutching folders, prescriptions, and paperwork. Then she looked back at Daniel. Because somebody has to care. The words were simple, but Daniel felt them cut through the darkness of that morning. She continued. I can't fix the whole hospital. I can't change everything that happens here. But if one frightened person walks out those doors believing that at least someone cared about them, then maybe I did something right. Daniel felt something shift inside him. For hours he had been collecting evidence of everything that was going wrong. But this nurse was evidence of something else. The problem was not that everyone who worked there had lost their humanity. There were still employees who saw the patient before they saw the paperwork. People who understood that behind every number was fear, pain, a family, a life. You're doing more than you realize, Daniel said. The nurse looked at him slightly surprised. He said nothing else. He could not tell her who he really was. He could not explain to her why those words had meant so much to him. But, in that moment, Daniel understood that the inspection could not become an indiscriminate punishment. There were serious problems that had to be fixed. People who would have to answer for their actions. Practices that could no longer be allowed to continue. But there were also employees who were still trying to do the right thing inside a system that had grown bigger than they could control. And that distinction mattered. A lot. Daniel remembered the hospital administration's statement. There are no serious problems. Now he knew that was false. The problems existed. He had seen them himself. But he also knew something he had not understood when he first walked through those doors that morning. The hospital was not completely devoid of compassion. Compassion simply seemed to survive in certain people, almost in spite of everything around them. The nurse said goodbye because she had to get back to work. Daniel watched her walk down the hallway. For the first time since entering the hospital, he felt something besides anger. He felt a small sense of hope. Maybe fixing the hospital did not mean starting over from nothing. Maybe it meant protecting, strengthening, and multiplying the very thing he had just witnessed. People who still remembered one simple truth. When someone walks into a hospital, sick and afraid, they do not need to feel important. They need to feel that someone cares whether they live or die. Daniel watched the nurse until she disappeared at the end of the hallway. For a few seconds the waiting room seemed different. Not because there were fewer people. Not because the doors were opening any faster. Not because the problems had suddenly disappeared. But after hours of witnessing indifference, Daniel had just been reminded of something that had nearly been buried beneath paperwork, rushing staff, and bad decisions. The hospital was also filled with people who still knew how to care. Not everyone had forgotten why they were there. A short time later, the atmosphere shifted again. Another patient needed help. This time the response was immediate. Someone get a wheelchair. There was no endless argument. No unnecessary questions at the worst possible moment. Several employees moved quickly. He needs help. Get the emergency team. Daniel watched as the staff rushed to the patient. The difference was impossible to miss. The same walls. The same hospital. The same system. But when the right people made the right decision, everything changed. The patient was treated. After several tense minutes, a sentence finally brought relief to everyone nearby. He's stable. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. Those words carried enormous weight after everything he had witnessed. He's stable. 2 simple words. But behind them were professionals who had responded. People who had not first asked how much money the man had. They had not cared whether he knew someone important. They had not judged whether his clothes looked expensive or cheap. They had seen a person who needed help. And they acted. That was what Daniel had come looking for, even if he had not fully realized it when he entered that morning. Not just evidence of what was broken, but the difference between a hospital that simply processes patients and one that truly cares for them. From his chair, he watched the activity in the hallways again. He thought about the nurse he had spoken with only minutes earlier. The woman who had spent 6 years witnessing injustice and still believed in one simple principle. Somebody has to care. Now Daniel understood those words more clearly. It was not about changing an entire institution with one dramatic gesture. Sometimes caring meant bringing a wheelchair before asking someone to sign a form. It meant noticing when a patient's breathing sounded wrong. It meant looking at a frightened person and speaking to them like a human being. It meant acting because someone needed help, not because that person had something to offer in return. Daniel had also seen doctors who did exactly that. They treated whoever needed help without stopping to wonder whether the patient had connections. They did not ask who a person was before deciding how much that person's suffering mattered. And in the middle of all that chaos, those small acts were beginning to carry enormous weight. Because they proved that Street Isabel County Hospital had not completely lost its humanity. Humanity was still there. It was simply surrounded by practices that far too often managed to silence it. Daniel rested his elbows on his knees. For the first time since beginning the undercover inspection, he started imagining what truly fixing the hospital would require. It would not be enough to punish whoever had accepted money. It would not be enough to review wait times. It would not be enough to rewrite a policy and hang a new set of rules on a wall. If the hospital genuinely wanted to change, it would have to make that nurse stop feeling like an exception. Helping someone before asking for paperwork would have to stop being considered extraordinary. Treating a person with dignity regardless of their financial situation would need to become just as natural as treating someone who walked in wearing expensive clothes. No employee should have to fight alone to keep compassion alive inside a system that seemed to have learned to look at a person's financial status first. The inspection was still underway. Daniel had not yet revealed his identity. To everyone around him, he was still James Carter, the uninsured patient who had been waiting for hours. And precisely because of that, he was able to see things an official visit might have hidden. There were employees who failed. There were actions that could not be tolerated. But there were also ordinary people who continued doing the right thing when no one important was watching. People who were not looking for recognition. People who would probably never appear in any leadership report. People who had no idea an inspector was observing them. And that was what mattered most. Because true dedication does not appear when an inspection begins. It appears when a patient is afraid, when nobody is applauding, and when caring for someone offers no reward. Daniel lifted his eyes toward the hallways. Now he knew it for certain. The hospital needed to change. But it was still worth saving. Because among all the indifference, there were still people who remembered that medicine began long before a diagnosis. It began with something much simpler. Seeing the person in front of you and deciding that their life matters. That afternoon, while Daniel continued watching the hallways of Street Isabel County Hospital under the identity of James Carter, something was about to happen far away from that waiting room. Something was about to change the atmosphere of the hospital completely. In one of the administrative offices, the phone rang. Street Isabel County Hospital. How may I help you? On the other end, a serious voice identified itself as a representative of the State Department of Health. We're calling to inform you that an unannounced compliance inspection will take place tomorrow morning. There was a brief silence. Tomorrow? Asked the director, Michael Reynolds, unable to hide his surprise. That is correct. Michael slowly straightened in his chair. Who will be conducting the inspection? The answer was short. You will receive the inspection team's credentials when they arrive. The call ended. Within seconds, the comm inside the office disappeared. Michael grabbed the internal phone. His voice was no longer relaxed. Listen carefully. State health inspectors are coming tomorrow. The news began spreading through the departments. I want every area prepared. Every patient record reviewed. Compliance reports ready. All logs organized. Everything. One of the department managers asked nervously, do they know about the complaints? Michael remained silent for several seconds. Those complaints? The same complaints hospital leadership had dismissed for weeks as nothing more than exaggerations. The same complaints they insisted did not reveal any serious problems. The same complaints Daniel was personally testing at that very moment while sitting among patients who had already been waiting for hours. They don't know anything, the director finally replied. The tension seemed to ease for a moment. Good. But Daniel knew. And that was the part none of them could possibly imagine. While hospital administrators began preparing the facility to present its best face the following morning, the inspector they were expecting was already inside. He had watched a patient who arrived later receive attention first. He had heard an older man quietly accept that people like us simply had to wait. He had watched an elderly woman struggling to breathe become delayed even briefly by paperwork. He had seen an employee suggest to a desperate husband that there was another way to speed up his wife's care. And he had also met the people who were still trying to do the right thing. None of that could be erased by organizing a few documents. None of it could be hidden by placing a folder neatly on a desk. That same afternoon, the hospital suddenly seemed to have discovered an energy it had not shown its patients. Procedures were being reviewed. Reports were being prepared. Managers were making sure every department was ready. Everything had to look flawless when the inspectors walked through the doors the next morning. And there was the irony. For hours, James Carter had been practically invisible. An uninsured man. A patient who appeared to have little money. Someone they could make wait without offering much explanation. But one phone call from the State Department of Health was enough to put the entire institution on high alert. Daniel did not need anyone to explain it to him. The difference was impossible to ignore. For patients there were waits. For complaints there were excuses. For people asking for help there were often procedures. But the moment the word inspection appeared, suddenly everything became urgent. Everything required immediate attention. Everything had to be ready. Daniel thought about that while sitting with the battered medical folder in his hands. If he had arrived from the beginning wearing a suit displaying his official credentials and using his real name, he probably would have found exactly the hospital they were preparing now. An organized hospital. Attentive. Careful. A hospital fully aware that every action could be evaluated. But that was not the institution he had experienced throughout the day. He had seen what happened before the phone call. He had seen how people behaved when they believed no one with authority was watching. And that was precisely why the undercover inspection had been necessary. The next morning they could smile. They could present perfectly organized records. They could repeat that every patient received equal treatment. But it was already too late. The reality had been exposed hours earlier. Michael Reynolds and the rest of the hospital leadership believed they had an entire night to prepare for the inspection. What they did not know was that the most important inspection had already taken place right in front of them. And the man some of them had treated as though he did not matter would be the one standing there the next morning listening to every explanation they had prepared. The following morning, Street Isabel County Hospital looked like a completely different place. The hallways were spotless. Documents had been organized. Department heads stood ready and attentive. After hours of nervous preparation, Michael Reynolds was convinced he had finally brought everything under control. When the inspection team arrived, he put on his most professional expression. "Good morning. Welcome to Street Isabel County Hospital. We're completely prepared for your inspection." Then he saw him. For several seconds Michael could not understand what he was looking at. Standing before him was the same man. The same face. The same eyes. But he no longer looked like the invisible patient from the waiting room. He was Dr. Daniel Mitchell, the state health inspector they had been expecting since early that morning. Michael's face went pale. Who is this man? Daniel looked directly at him. He did not need to raise his voice. After everything he had witnessed the day before, calmness was far more powerful than any shout. "You should know who I am." Silence fell over the group. Michael stared at him again. And then he began to understand. The patient no one had considered important. The man in the worn-out jacket. The man they had known as Javier Romero. The uninsured patient who had spent hours sitting among everyone else in the waiting room. He had never been who they thought he was. "I'm Dr. Daniel Mitchell," he finally said. "I'm a senior health inspector with the State Department of Health." No one answered. The revelation hit the hospital leadership with a force they could barely hide. Michael immediately remembered the phone call from the day before. The orders to prepare every report. The sudden urgency to review patient records. The frantic effort to make the hospital look flawless that morning, and then the most uncomfortable truth finally became clear. The inspector had not just arrived. He had been inside the hospital since the previous day. Watching everything. Daniel slowly turned toward one of the employees. His expression hardened. "And I saw you too." The employee lowered his eyes. "Sir, I saw you take an unofficial payment from a desperate husband who was trying to get his wife seen sooner." The employee's mouth fell open. "I can explain?" Daniel slowly shook his head. "No." He paused. "You had plenty of opportunities to explain yourself while you were taking advantage of that man's desperation." No one moved. What had happened the day before could no longer be buried inside a report. It could not be polished away. It could not be reduced to a convenient statistic. Daniel had been there. He had witnessed it himself. Michael finally tried to respond. "Dr. Mitchell, I had no idea everything that was happening on the floor." Daniel turned toward him. Instead of defending Michael, those words seemed to confirm exactly what Daniel had been trying to uncover all along. "That is exactly the problem." Michael fell silent. Daniel continued. "Yesterday I walked through those doors wearing old clothes without insurance and without any visible credentials. To you, I was simply James Carter. A man with very little money and a stomachache." He looked around the room. "Now I want to ask you one question." Michael held his gaze, though his discomfort was becoming impossible to hide. "If I had walked in yesterday wearing a suit, introduced myself as a state health inspector and shown you my credentials, do you honestly believe I would have been treated the same way?" No one answered. They didn't need to. Daniel already knew the answer. No. The single word hung heavily in the room. "You would have welcomed me differently. You would have paid attention. You would have listened to every word I said. Maybe someone from leadership would have personally come out to meet me." Michael lowered his head slightly. Daniel stepped toward him. "But yesterday you thought I was nobody important." The words carried weight because they were true. "And that is exactly what I came here to find out. Not how this hospital treats someone when it knows that person has authority, but how it treats someone when it believes that person has none." Daniel remembered the older man who had waited for hours. The elderly woman struggling to breathe while staff asked for her information. The desperate husband who had been willing to hand over the little cash he had. And he remembered the employees who had still chosen to act with compassion. All of it had happened during the same day. A poor person does not feel less pain, Daniel continued. They do not suffer less because their clothes are worn out. Their life is not worth less because they have less money. Michael made no attempt to interrupt him. For the first time since the inspection began, hospital leadership had no report to hide behind. Standing in front of them was the man who had personally experienced everything they had spent weeks dismissing as exaggerations. Daniel looked once more at the spotless hallways they had worked so hard to prepare. Then he spoke with a calmness that was more powerful than anger. Yesterday I saw this hospital when you believed no one important was watching. He paused. That is the version of this hospital I came here to inspect. The silence that followed was so complete that for a few moments it seemed as though the entire hospital had stopped. Michael Reynolds said nothing. Neither did the administrator standing beside him. There was no explanation anyone could offer that would erase what Daniel had witnessed with his own eyes. The inspector slowly looked across the group. He was no longer pretending to be James Carter. He no longer needed the disguise. But after spending so many hours as a seemingly poor uninsured patient, he understood something no official meeting could ever have taught him. I want you to understand one thing, Daniel said calmly. A patient with less money does not walk through those doors carrying less pain. Michael finally looked up. Daniel continued. Their illness is not less serious because they are wearing an old jacket. Their fear is not smaller because they do not have insurance. And their life is not worth less because their bank account is empty. No one moved. His words did not need to be harsher. The truth was already harsh enough. Daniel remembered the older man sitting there for hours. He remembered the resignation in his voice when he said that people like them were used to waiting. He remembered the man who arrived later and was quickly escorted into an exam room. The elderly woman who could barely breathe, while her son begged someone to help her. The desperate husband who finally pulled the little cash he had from his pocket because he believed it might be the only way to get his wife seen. All of those moments had come from the same underlying problem. The feeling that some lives seem to receive more attention than others. A public hospital does not exist to decide who deserves more dignity, Daniel continued. It exists to care for whoever needs help. His voice became firmer. Some people arrive in expensive cars. Others take the bus. Some have money. Others have almost nothing. Some carry insurance cards. Others do not. He paused. But when they walk through these doors, they all have one thing in common. Daniel looked directly at Michael. They are patients. That word remained hanging in the air. Patients. Not privileged customers. Not first-class people and second-class people. Not important names standing at the front while ordinary people were left waiting. Patients. And every patient deserves dignity, Daniel added. He walked a few steps down the hallway. It was the same hallway he had walked through the day before, trying to remain unnoticed. Yet everything seemed different now that everyone knew his position. The looks were more cautious. The answers would undoubtedly be more polite. And that was exactly what concerned him. Yesterday you treated me the way you believed James Carter should be treated, Daniel said. Today you're treating me like Dr. Daniel Mitchell. He turned toward them. But I am still the same person. No one could argue with that. My pain would have been the same. My body would have been the same. My need for help would have been exactly the same. Michael took a deep breath. Daniel slowly shook his head. Healthcare should never depend on how much money someone has in the bank. The words were simple. That was precisely why they were impossible to dismiss. Because illness does not check your income before entering your body. He looked toward the waiting room. The chairs were still there. The same chairs where he had spent hours the day before. And compassion should not check it either. For the first time since revealing his identity, some of the hardness left Daniel's expression. Because not everything he had witnessed had been disgraceful. He also remembered the nurse who had stopped to ask how he was feeling. The woman who had sadly admitted that uninsured patients were too often treated like problems instead of people. The employees who had moved quickly when someone needed urgent help. The professionals who still saw human beings where others seemed to see paperwork. I saw something good yesterday too, he said. Several people raised their heads. I saw employees help before worrying about paperwork. I saw professionals care for someone because that person needed help, not because they had connections. Daniel's expression softened. And I saw people who still remembered why they chose healthcare in the first place. Then he looked directly at Michael. That is why this inspection is not simply about finding people to blame. It is about understanding what kind of hospital you want to be. The director remained silent. Daniel took one final step toward him. Because the day a patient has to prove they have money before they can expect to be treated with respect is the day this hospital has forgotten its most basic purpose. He paused. No one here should have to be rich to be heard. No one should have to be important to receive compassion. And no one should walk out of these doors believing their life mattered less than the person sitting beside them. Daniel looked toward the waiting room one last time. The day before he had walked in searching for evidence. Now, Daniel knew the problem went far beyond wait times. It was a matter of dignity. And until every person who walked through those doors was treated as a life of equal value, the inspection was not truly over. Daniel's words lingered in the hallway. For several seconds no one knew how to respond. Michael Reynolds stood in front of him, but the confidence he had shown when the inspection team arrived was gone. After hearing everything Daniel had witnessed, it was impossible to keep insisting that the complaints were merely exaggerated. Still, Daniel had not come there to publicly destroy the hospital. There was an important difference between holding people accountable and tearing down an institution that thousands of people still depended on. Daniel took a deep breath before speaking again. "I want something to be absolutely clear," he said. "This inspection is not about shutting this hospital down." Michael slowly raised his eyes. "Then what happens now?" Daniel looked across the group of administrators standing before him. "What happens now is what should have happened a long time ago." His voice remained firm, but there was no cruelty in it. "We fix what is broken." The statement changed the tone of the entire conversation. It did not mean forgetting what had happened. And it certainly did not mean minimizing it. Daniel had seen too much for that. He had witnessed unequal treatment, indifference, unjustified delays, and completely unacceptable behavior involving an unofficial payment. All of those actions would have consequences. But he had also seen nurses and doctors who still treated people with compassion. People who, even inside a damaged system, remembered that every patient was a human life, not a problem to be processed. And because of those employees and because of the patients who depended on the hospital, the institution needed to change, not disappear. Change. Daniel made it clear that a complete review of the hospital's patient care policies would begin immediately. It was not enough for documents to claim that everyone deserved respectful treatment. They had to prove that those standards were actually being followed. Every procedure would be examined. Every point that allowed unfair differences in treatment would be reviewed. Care could not depend on how someone looked, how much money they had, or whether an employee believed that person had the power to complain. Staff training would also be strengthened. "I don't want rehearsed speeches for when an inspector walks through the door," Daniel explained. "I want the same respect shown when nobody is watching." The room fell silent. Employees would receive renewed training in patient care, dignity, equal treatment, and professional responsibility. Not as a formality. Not as another sheet of paper to sign. But as a real obligation. Because Daniel knew a written policy meant nothing if a sick person could still walk into an emergency room and feel invisible. The complaints that had accumulated over the previous weeks would not be buried either. They would be reviewed one by one. The stories of patients who had waited too long, the reports of unequal treatment. The complaints from people who had felt humiliated because they lacked money or resources. Every one of those accounts would be investigated. For too long those voices had been treated like inconveniences. Now they would become a central part of the review. Unethical practices would also be addressed directly. There would be no room for secret arrangements, special favors, or unofficial payments. What Daniel had witnessed with the desperate husband could never happen again. A patient should never feel forced to reach into their pocket just to receive medical attention. And no family member should ever be placed in a position where their fear and desperation could be exploited by someone who was supposed to help them. The hospital would also have to establish stronger safeguards to ensure that every patient received the same basic dignity. With money or without it. With insurance or without insurance. Dressed in expensive clothes or worn-out ones. With powerful connections or completely alone. That was the change Daniel wanted to see. Not a hospital that looked perfect during an inspection. A hospital that was fair every day of the week. Michael remained silent. For the first time he seemed to understand that the problem could not be solved by hiding one bad practice or blaming a single employee. The entire system had to be examined. Daniel looked around the room. "This is not about destroying everything that exists here." He paused. "It is about making sure the worst parts of this hospital never destroy the good that still remains." He thought about the nurse who had stopped to speak with him, the employees who had reacted when someone desperately needed help, the workers who continued treating patients with respect even when no one was watching. They proved that the hospital could be different. What had to change was making sure that compassion no longer depended on the personal kindness of a handful of employees. It had to become the standard. Part of the culture. Part of their responsibility. Daniel looked at Michael again. "Starting today, every complaint will matter. Every improper practice will be investigated. And every patient must be able to trust that they will be treated like a person, not a wallet." There was no applause. None was needed. What was beginning that day was far more difficult than a routine inspection. It was a reform. And for the first time in years, St. Isabel County Hospital would have to confront the problems it had spent so long denying. The changes began. Not overnight. Not by magic. But they began. Street Isabel County Hospital launched a comprehensive review of its patient care policies. Staff received additional training. Complaints that had been ignored for far too long were finally investigated seriously. Unethical practices were addressed and stronger safeguards were put in place to prevent patients from receiving different treatment because of their money, appearance, or personal circumstances. Yet the most important change was never written into a policy. It happened inside the people themselves. Daniel understood that as he walked through those hallways one final time. The day before, he had entered wearing an old jacket, worn sneakers, and a battered folder. Many people had looked at him and decided without knowing anything about him how much respect he deserved. But the man they had considered insignificant was the very person with the authority to evaluate the entire system. And that was the most uncomfortable lesson of all. We never truly know who is standing in front of us. But the truth is, we should never need to know. A person does not deserve respect because of their title, or their money, or because they might have the power to punish us tomorrow. He deserved respect simply because he was a human being. Daniel had never gone to the hospital looking for special treatment. He went there to find out whether everyone else was receiving the dignity they deserved. And when he finally walked away, he left behind a truth that no one in that hospital would easily forget. A patient's wallet should never determine the value of their life. Illness does not care whether someone is rich or poor. Neither does fear. Neither does pain. And compassion should never make that distinction. We are often too quick to judge someone by a worn-out jacket, an old pair of shoes, or the way they look. But behind that appearance may be an entire story we know nothing about. And above all, there is a dignity that no one has the right to take away. Perhaps that is one of the most important lessons in this story. Treat people well when you believe they have nothing to offer you, because that is when your true character is revealed. And now I want to ask you something. Do you think we still judge people too quickly because of their money or appearance? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. And if this story made you think, moved you, or reminded you that every person deserves to be treated with dignity, subscribe to the channel and join us for more stories. Because sometimes one story is all it takes to change the way we see the people around us.